Hey guys, Chris here from Hockey Tutorial, and today in this video I wanted to look at one of the ultimate questions in trying to save money when you're buying your gear. And that's if you should buy mid-range or if you should buy last season's or last generation's top spec gear. I wanted to highlight some of the differences from all of the equipment across the board, whether it's protective, whether it's sticks or skates, and hopefully share a bit of insight into the things that you should consider if you're trying to use the best route to be able to save yourself some money while you're buying your hockey equipment. Let's get into it. So I think the first thing to consider is definitely going to be what you need, because at the end of the day, we're all individuals and our needs compared to somebody else's might be completely different. That might be based on budget, that might be based on our playing style, or of course the levels that we play at, and how many times that we're on the ice. All of these different things really affect what type of equipment we should be looking to purchase next. So for example, looking at protective. Now, if you're the type of player that plays very frequently or you play very competitive hockey, there's checking, and you're trying to figure out what you should purchase to be able to save the most money and of course get the most bang for your buck when you're getting new protective. Based on you being on the ice very frequently, playing competitively and playing checking hockey, if you're trying to work out if you should go mid-range with, say, a new release of protective gear to try and save money instead of going for top spec and spending a lot more, because of the type of hockey that you play, it might make more sense for you to consider buying the previous generation or the previous season's top spec equipment. Now, normally you can find some incredibly good deals on previous generation gear, still top spec, still aimed at a high level of play or a very competitive level of play, which means that you're going to be getting more protection. Although the prices, for example, between mid-range gear that's current versus top spec gear from the previous season might be very similar, because last season's equipment is aimed at a high level of play, you're going to be getting a lot more bang for your buck in that area, because it's going to be much more protective because it's tailored towards playing a high level of hockey. Now in reverse, if you're the type of player that's on the ice perhaps maybe once or twice a week, you're playing recreationally or beer league, depending on where you are from, you might call it something slightly different. That type of a player, if they're not playing, for example, in a checking league, might not necessarily need the same level of protection as somebody that's playing much more competitive hockey with checking. So these are the types of things that you need to consider. Somebody that plays maybe once or twice a week, that plays very casually, not too serious, isn't going to be throwing or receiving too many big hits on the ice. That could be the type of player that benefits for going for mid-range for a line of protective that's just been released. While we're on the subject of protective, looking at helmets, we've created an entire video on cheap versus expensive helmets that I'll link down below in the video description. This is definitely a video that I would recommend every single hockey player watch, and if you do happen to click on the link, please be sure to share it with somebody that might have not seen it, because there is a lot of important information there that all hockey players, regardless of what level that you're playing at, should definitely know about the helmets that they're using. That will be down below in the video description. So when we look at sticks, if you're trying to figure out what you can do to save money here, it's very similar to what I mentioned in protective. If you're the type of player that's on the ice very frequently, and if you're the player that notices the difference between mid-range and top spec sticks, this is something that really stands out to some players, and other players don't really mind what level of stick they're using and may not be able to tell the difference between a mid-range and a top spec when they're on the ice actually playing. So if you're the type of player that really notices the pop, the different materials that the stick's made from, the feel for the puck, the way that the puck reacts when you shoot, when you receive passes on one-timers, all of that good stuff, then it might be best for you to look at buying last generation's or last season's top spec range. Because with sticks, depending on which manufacturers you look at, some of the changes, if you're to compare a newly released top spec stick against the previous generation top spec stick, some of the changes and advancements can be quite incremental. They're not massive. You're not going to pick up the newly released stick from this manufacturer and compare it to the previous generation and be like, this thing is a completely different animal. It might be a little bit more responsive, it might have a little bit more pop, a slightly more enhanced feel, very incremental. So picking up the previous generation stick to save yourself quite a considerable amount of money depending on where you're looking when you're buying your sticks is never a bad idea. But of course, if you're the type of player that wants to have the newest, wants to have the most advanced, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with purchasing the newest model of stick. A lot of players are guilty of wanting to have that. I myself definitely am guilty of wanting to do that. But if you're trying to save yourself some money, looking at the previous generation top spec range versus the newly released ranges and looking at the mid-range section might not always be the best thing for you to do. It really does depend on the type of player that you are, the type of level that you're playing at, and how much you notice the difference between mid-range and top spec. Now you'll find some awesome deals depending on what online stores or what physical stores you look at on previous generation top spec sticks versus new release top spec or new release mid-range. This is a great way to be able to save yourself some money. But then again, in reverse, if you're the type of player that doesn't really notice whether you're using a mid-range stick or a top spec stick, you don't really mind, then you could benefit from going for a current line that's just been released and aiming for mid-range to save yourself some money. It doesn't make sense to overspend in hockey, especially on the equipment if you don't need to. As much as all of us love this sport, let's be honest, it is an expensive sport to play. It's definitely a privileged sport for us to be able to play it. So if there's anything that you could do as a player to be able to save yourself some money, or if somebody else like your parents or your guardian is buying your equipment for you, or even your team, if there's ways that you can navigate through the different ranges of equipment that are available to find something that still performs for you but saves money, why not? Now, when we look at skates, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. Of course, you could use the same formula that we've just used on other pieces of equipment, whether you go for mid-range for a newly released range or you go for top spec from the previous season or previous generation. But with skates, especially over the last 12 months, there has been numerous advancements that have been made, whether it be in the custom skate department or it be in one-piece boot frames, for example, some of the skates that we've seen from CCM. Now, this isn't favoritism in any way, it's just facts. And when you compare some of the skates from previous generations, although they're top spec, some of the skates that are mid-range that are being released right now and that are coming out over the next few months have a lot more features and a lot more advancements that will benefit pretty much any type of player. So that definitely has to come into consideration when you're trying to figure out what to go for. So a good example of this would be if we look at the jet speed range that has been recently released. I'm talking about the FT2 skates from CCM. Now with these skates, if we compare them to the FT1, although they look very similar, the FT2 skates have basically been redesigned and reconstructed from the ground up, including the blade and the holder. Of course, I've done a video comparing these two skates that I'll link down below and also up above if you'd like to watch that in more detail. But very quickly, if we look at the FT1s, which are the pro-level skate from the previous generation that CCM released, compared to, I guess you could refer to it as a high-end intermediate FT490, which is the skates that are just below the FT2, part of the new range that's just been released. If you compare these FT490s to the FT1s, there are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of benefits with the FT490s, although they're not even a top spec skate. They still have that one-piece boot frame, which was a massive advancement compared to any type of other skate construction that we'd previously seen from CCM. And of course, the FT490s feature the XS holder, which features that dial that allows you to switch out your steel if you break a blade or if you lose an edge incredibly quickly with zero tools. This is a massive improvement from what we saw previously from CCM, which involved using tools to be able to switch out the steel. For a lot of elite level players or pro level players, especially NHL players, that type of an option simply isn't viable, and it's also one of the reasons why you'll see skates from other manufacturers like Graf or True fitted with the quick release trigger system that we saw from Bauer, because being able to switch out your steels, especially for an elite level of play, is a big deal. Players need to be able to do that to be able to keep themselves in play, so seeing this introduced to CCM skates is fantastic. So for me, if I was to compare the FT1s to the FT490, I would go with the FT490 purely because of that XS holder. And on the subject of price, depending on where you look, I've seen the FT490 priced for around $599 US, while the FT1 has been priced around the $700 mark. So essentially you're getting a skate that's easily comparable to the previous top spec, the FT1s, but it's from a newly released range from CCM, which has new features, new benefits, and is cheaper. This is also the same if you look at other manufacturers like Bauer. Now, if you look at the 2S Pro, which is the newest skate that Bauer has released in the Supreme range, and we compare that to the 1S, which was the previous generation top spec skate, of course, I will include down below a video comparison between these two skates where we go into a lot more detail from the ground up and cover all of the differences between them. But if we look at them from purely a price perspective, bear in mind the 1S was the previous generation's top spec, and to this day, in terms of the standard of the equipment that we have available, is easily still a top spec skate compared to the 2S Pros. The 2S Pros are $300, depending on where you look, more expensive than the previous generation's 1S. So in this instance, if you're trying to work out which is going to be the better option, and creating these versus videos is something that we do very regularly anytime something new is released in the top spec department with sticks and also skates with all manufacturers. These will be linked down below if you do want to check them out. But if you compare the spec between these two skates, there are some changes, of course, but you have to ask yourself if those changes are actually something that you need. Would you rather have an extra $300 saved in your bank account, or would you rather spend an extra $300 on getting those new features? For me personally, I would go with the previous generation top spec, which is the 1S in this instance, save myself $300 while still getting a high-end, high-performance skate. So really this comes down to what you as a player personally need. If you're to compare your needs to somebody else, they may be completely different. If you're able to isolate exactly what you need, it'll help you be able to decide which direction you should go in. If it's mid-range from a newly released range of equipment, or if it's going to be top spec from a previous range or previous generation of gear. So make sure you consider how much time you spend on the ice and how frequently you're on the ice, what level that you're playing at, of course if it's going to be checking or non-checking hockey, because that plays a big part in deciding which protective equipment you should go for, and of course making sure to identify what features that you need to be able to keep you in play, whether it's being able to switch out your runners very quickly should one break or should you lose an edge, All of these different things need to be considered to be able to point you in the right direction of what equipment you should go for. So to answer the ultimate question of should you buy mid-range or should you buy top spec from the previous generation, it really depends on what your needs are. But it's super important for me to mention that there is nothing wrong with buying last season's or last generation's stock. It doesn't make sense for you to spend more on an expensive game that we all know is very expensive to play. It doesn't make sense for you to spend more if you don't need to. If you can use these points to help identify that you could save a ton of money if you go for the previous generation top spec, or if you drop down and go for a mid-range level of equipment from a newly released range to save you some money. I personally, a few months back, dropped from using top spec skates to using one level below. Currently, I'm using the FT490s, and the reason for that was the level of hockey that I'm playing and how much I'm on the ice doesn't require me to have a top spec skate. So it actually makes a lot more sense for me to go for the model just below, which still has a lot of those features and that one-piece boot frame that I've gotten used to over the last couple of years, and still gives me a good performing skate that's more than adequate for the level that I'm playing at. So hopefully you can use these points to help you decide on what equipment that you're going to get to hopefully save you some money. This is definitely one of those ongoing types of videos where if you have any questions, because equipment is forever changing and forever being updated and improved, please leave them down below in the comments section. I'll be more than happy to answer as many of them as I can. If I don't have an answer for you, then I'll always try and find an answer for you by speaking to the manufacturers themselves. But I hope this video has helped to give you a bit of insight into this realm. Try to save yourself some money if you don't need to spend more on your equipment than you should be. But again, thank you very much for watching this video. Please thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done already. And if there's any videos that you want us to shoot that we've not done already, make sure you search our channel before you make the request. Leave your comments down below and I will catch you in the next one. But make sure you thumbs up, subscribe, follow us on Instagram, and take care till next time.